They say art imitates life, but sometimes art exposes what life tries to hide. The coffee dripped from her hair like liquid midnight, pooling on the cafeteria floor in abstract patterns that would later become evidence in an FBI investigation. But in that moment, as hundreds of teenagers laughed and filmed, nobody knew they were witnessing the first brushstroke of a masterpiece that would bring down an empire. Before we dive into this incredible story, if it resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe. Your comments mean the world to me, and if these stories touch your heart, consider supporting through the thanks button below. It helps me continue sharing these powerful moments that need to be heard. Thank you for being here. The harsh fluorescent lights of Riverside High School's cafeteria had witnessed countless teenage dramas over the decades. The peeling paint on the walls, the sticky tables that janitors had given up properly cleaning, the perpetual smell of reheated pizza mixed with industrial disinfectant, it all created an atmosphere of institutional neglect that seemed to seep into the souls of everyone who spent time there. But on this particular Tuesday in April, something different hung in the air. Maybe it was the way Samantha Walker sat in her usual corner, her hoodie pulled up despite the warmth of spring. Maybe it was how her pencil moved across the paper with unusual intensity, creating shadows and depth that seemed to pull reality into the page. Or maybe it was the way Ethan Harrison kept checking his phone, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth, his legendary confidence flickering like a bulb about to burn out. Samantha didn't look up when the cafeteria doors burst open and Ethan's crew strutted in. She'd learned long ago that invisibility was an art form, and she'd mastered it the same way she'd mastered the pressure control on a spray can at 2 in the morning. Her fingers were steady as she sketched, but under the table. Her foot tapped a rhythm only she could hear, the same rhythm that guided her when she scaled walls and transformed blank spaces into accusations the city couldn't ignore. "Yo, you good, bro?" The voice belonged to Marcus, not the Marcus from her outline, but Ethan's right-hand man, a linebacker with hands like ham hocks and a brain that had been concussed into compliance. Ethan's response was to slam his tray down hard enough to make the freshman at the next table jump. "I'm fine," Ethan said, but his voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut. His eyes swept the cafeteria like a predator seeking prey. Or maybe, and this was something only Samantha's trained artist's eye caught, like prey checking for predators, Nathan O'Brien sat 3 tables away, organizing art supplies with the kind of meticulous care that spoke of a need for control in a world that offered very little. The rainbow pin on the inside of his collar caught the light for just a moment as he glanced up at Ethan, and something passed between them, a flicker of knowledge, of shared secrets that existed in the space between what everyone saw and what was really there. "Did you guys see Ghost's new piece?" Grace Peterson's voice cut through the ambient chatter as she approached Ethan's table, her phone already out and recording. "It's all over Instagram. They say it's a memorial for nobody cares about some wannabe Banksy." Ethan interrupted, but his knuckles went white around his water bottle. "Probably just some loser with daddy issues and too much time." Samantha's pencil paused for exactly 1 heartbeat. Under her hoodie, a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. If only he knew that his brother David's face had been her first real portrait, painted on the underpass where he'd been found, turning a place of death into a shrine of remembrance. If only he knew that she'd spent hours studying photographs, learning the curve of David's smile, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed. Details Ethan probably couldn't remember anymore through the haze of performance-enhancing drugs and coached grief. "Speaking of losers," Marcus said, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone about to do something cruel for entertainment. "Check out Art Girl over there. What is she? Like, mute or something? The cafeteria's acoustic design, an accident of 1970s architecture, meant that voices carried in unexpected ways. Samantha heard every word, but her hand never stopped moving. She was drawing Ethan now, capturing something in his expression that he probably didn't even know he was showing, the way his eyes kept darting to the door, the micro-tremor in his throwing hand, the hollow look of someone running on empty. "Leave her alone," Nathan said quietly, but his voice carried. Several heads turned. What was that? Rainbow Boy? This from another teammate, Derek, who had the kind of casual cruelty that came from never having to face consequences. "I said, leave her alone." Nathan stood up, his hands shaking slightly as he packed his supplies. "She's not bothering anyone." Ethan stood up slowly, and the cafeteria seemed to contract around him. This was his kingdom, his stage, and everyone knew their roles. Except today. Something was different today. The script was about to be thrown out entirely. "You know what?" "You're right," Ethan said, and his smile was the kind that made smart people take a step back. "She's not bothering anyone, just sitting there, all mysterious, probably thinking she's better than everyone else." He picked up his coffee black, no sugar, because warriors don't need sweetness, and started walking. The cafeteria fell silent in waves, like dominoes falling in reverse. Someone started filming. Someone always started filming. Samantha could feel him approaching, could smell the mix of athletic deodorant and something else, fierce sweat, the kind her father sometimes woke up drenched in after nightmares about Kandahar. She set her pencil down carefully, precisely, like a sniper preparing for a shot. "Hey, Art Girl!" Ethan's voice was loud enough to echo. "What you drawing? Let me see." He reached for her sketchbook, and that's when she finally looked up. Their eyes met. And, for a moment, time seemed to stutter. Because Samantha Walker had their father's eyes that had seen too much, understood too much, and judged too little. They were eyes that looked at Ethan Harrison and saw not the golden boy, not the bully, not the king of Riverside High, but a scared kid carrying weight that was crushing him from the inside out. "You don't want to see," she said quietly, her voice rusty from disuse, but steady as bedrock. "Oh, but I do," Ethan insisted, and now his crew was gathering behind him, hyenas scenting blood. "See, I think you've been watching us, drawing us. That's kind of creepy. Don't you think?" Grace Peterson had moved closer, her camera catching every angle. Later, she'd wonder if she'd known something was about to happen. Some journalistic instinct that had made her check her storage space and battery life just minutes before. "I draw what I see," Samantha said simply. "And what do you see?" Ethan leaned closer, and she could smell the coffee on his breath, could see the dilated pupils that spoke of more than just caffeine in his system. "Pain," she said, the word dropping into the silence like a stone into still water. The silence stretched, elastic and dangerous. Someone giggled nervously. Someone else whispered, "Did she just—" Ethan's face went through a series of expressions too fast for most to catch. But Samantha was an artist. She saw everything: surprise, fear, rage, and finally, the mask slamming back into place. "Pain," he laughed. but it was hollow. "You want to see pain?" He lifted the coffee cup high, and in that moment, several things happened simultaneously. Nathan started to move, calling out, "Ethan, don't!" Isabella Young, watching from across the cafeteria, reached into her pocket and gripped something small and hard. Coach Sullivan, who'd been lurking near the entrance, stepped forward and then back, his championship ring catching the light as he touched it nervously. Grace's camera zoomed in, catching the play of emotions across Ethan's face, and Samantha Walker sat perfectly still, like she'd learned to do when her father's PTSD episodes turned the house into a minefield of triggers. She didn't flinch, didn't beg, didn't give him what he wanted. She just watched him with those knowing eyes. "You know what?" Ethan said, his voice cracking slightly. "You want to see pain? Let me show you what pain looks like." The coffee cup tilted. The liquid fell in slow motion, or maybe that was just how memory would record it later. Dark liquid cascading like a waterfall of spite, hitting Samantha's hood first, then soaking through to her hair, running down her face in rivulets that looked like tears she refused to shed. The cafeteria exploded in noise, laughter, gasps, the electronic chirp of phones capturing and sharing. Someone yelled, "World Star," because someone always yelled, "World Star," as if this was entertainment, as if this was content, as if this was anything other than a human being breaking another human being because he couldn't figure out how to fix himself. But Samantha still didn't move. The coffee dripped onto her sketchbook, turning her drawing of Ethan into a brown-stained prophecy. She sat there for 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, while the laughter crescendoed and Ethan stood there with the empty cup, looking somehow smaller than he had moments before. Then, with the kind of deliberate grace that would later make people watch the video over and over trying to understand, Samantha Walker stood up. Coffee ran down her face, her neck pooling in the hollow of her collarbone. Her hoodie was ruined. Her dignity, according to the social mathematics of high school, should have been destroyed. But something in the way she moved made the laughter falter and die. She reached not for napkins, not for her bag to run away, but for her markers. "What are you doing?" someone whispered. Samantha pulled off her coffee-soaked hoodie, revealing a white t-shirt underneath a blank canvas now stained with brown. She looked at it for a moment, tilting her head like she was seeing something nobody else could see yet. Then she began to draw, using the coffee as paint, mixing it with her markers. She started creating on her own body. Her hands moved with the same confidence that had tagged a dozen walls across the city, the same precision that had turned urban decay into galleries. But this wasn't vandalism. This was something else entirely. Is she drawing on herself? With the coffee. This is so weird. But as the image began to take shape, the whispers changed tone. Because Samantha wasn't just drawing randomly. She was creating a portrait, using the brown stains as shadows, adding definition with her markers. And slowly, horrifyingly, the face emerging on her shirt became recognizable. It was Ethan, but not the Ethan standing there with the empty cup, not the golden boy quarterback with the scholarship offers and the perfect smile. This was a different Ethan Younger, vulnerable, with tears streaming down his face. This was Ethan, the way Samantha had seen him 3 weeks ago, when she'd been leaving school late and had witnessed him in his car, sobbing over something on his phone, thinking he was alone. The cafeteria had gone dead silent, except for the sound of markers on fabric and coffee dripping onto linoleum. "Stop," Ethan said, but his voice was barely a whisper. Samantha didn't stop. Her hands moved faster now, adding details the way his hands had clutched the steering wheel, the way his shoulders had shaken, the way he'd looked exactly like his brother David in that moment, scared and alone and drowning in something bigger than himself. "Stop!" Ethan's voice cracked, and he stepped forward. But Marcus caught his arm. "Dude, everyone's watching," Marcus hissed, but his own face had gone pale. Because this wasn't how it was supposed to go. The victim was supposed to cry, run away, transfer schools maybe. They weren't supposed to turn their humiliation into art. They weren't supposed to fight back with truth. Grace Peterson's hands shook as she filmed, but she didn't stop. Later, she'd win a journalism award for this footage. But right now, she was just a 17-year-old girl watching another 17-year-old girl perform a kind of magic nobody had words for. "There," Samantha said finally, stepping back. The portrait was complete, Ethan's pain externalized on her coffee-stained shirt for everyone to see. "Now you all see what I see." She looked directly at Ethan, and for the second time, their eyes met, but this time, his were filled with tears he couldn't blame on allergies or exhaustion. "How?" he whispered. "How did you know?" "Because I see everything," Samantha said simply. "That's what ghosts do." The word hit the cafeteria like a lightning strike. Ghost. The mysterious artist who'd been leaving provocative murals around the city. The one who'd painted portraits of overdose victims on the walls of the pharmaceutical company. The one who'd turned the underpass where David Harrison died into a memorial that made grown men cry. "You're—" Nathan breathed, understanding flooding his face. "No way," someone else said. "Ghost is like, famous, she's nobody." But Isabella Young was already on her feet, her face a mixture of rage and recognition, because she'd spent hours at that underpass, staring at her brother's portrait, wondering who could have captured his essence so perfectly, who could have cared enough to make sure he wasn't forgotten. "It's her," Isabella said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "She's the one who's been painting them, all of them, the kids who died." The room erupted. Phones came out with renewed fervor. Someone ran for the door to tell others, to escape the sudden weight of witnessing something real in a place dedicated to superficiality. Coach Sullivan was already on his phone, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. But in the center of it all, Samantha Walker stood in her coffee-stained shirt, bearing Ethan Harrison's secret pain, and Ethan himself stood frozen, the empty cup falling from nerveless fingers to clatter on the floor. "Your brother," Samantha said, quietly enough that only Ethan could hear. "He was my first portrait. I'm sorry I couldn't save him. But maybe I can save you." And that's when Ethan Harrison, star quarterback, king of Riverside High, untouchable golden boy, fell to his knees in the middle of the cafeteria and began to sob. The cameras kept rolling. The phones kept recording. But something had shifted in the air. Something fundamental and irreversible. Because this wasn't just about bullying anymore. This wasn't just about coffee and humiliation and high school hierarchies. This was about the pills in Ethan's locker, the deals made under Friday night lights, the coach who supplied more than just game plans, the system that chewed up kids like David Harrison and spit them out in body bags, then demanded their siblings be strong, be champions, be everything except human. As Samantha knelt beside Ethan, ignoring the coffee still dripping from her hair, ignoring the 100 phones pointed at them. She said something that only Grace Peterson's sensitive microphone picked up. "It's okay to not be okay. Your brother knew that at the end. That's why I painted him smiling." The assistant principal's voice crackled over the intercom, demanding everyone return to class, threatening suspension for anyone caught with phones out. But nobody moved, because they all understood, on some level, that they were witnessing something that transcended detention slips and disciplinary actions. They were watching the first crack in a dam that was about to burst. And somewhere in the crowd, Coach Sullivan deleted a text message and started calculating how much damage control he could do before the walls came tumbling down. But Samantha Walker, the ghost who'd haunted the city's conscience with spray paint and truth, wasn't finished. This was just the beginning. The coffee was still wet on her shirt, the portrait of Ethan's pain still fresh and raw for all to see. She stood up, helped Ethan to his feet, and looked directly into Grace Peterson's camera. "My name is Samantha Walker," she said clearly. "I am Ghost, and this is just the first chapter of a story this whole city needs to hear." The bell rang, shrill and insistent, but it sounded more like an alarm, because everyone in that cafeteria understood that something had started that couldn't be stopped. The coffee had been spilled, literally and figuratively, and in the end, it would wash away so much more than anyone could imagine, as students slowly filed out, whispering and sharing videos. Samantha gathered her ruined sketchbook and markers. Ethan stood nearby, looking lost, his usual crew having melted away like fair-weather friends always do when things get real. "Why," he asked finally, "why show them that—" Samantha paused in her packing. "Because someone showed me once that pain shared is pain diminished. And because your brother asked me to." "What?" Ethan's voice was raw. "David's been dead for 6 months." "I know," Samantha said simply. "I was there, the night he died. I was painting a piece about pharmaceutical companies, and I saw him. He was still conscious for a few minutes, and he kept saying your name, said he was sorry, said to tell you it wasn't worth it." Ethan's legs gave out again, and this time Samantha caught him. 2 broken kids in a broken system, holding each other up while the world watched through smartphone screens. "He talked about you all the time," Ethan whispered. "Said there was this artist who understood, who was trying to change things. I didn't know. I didn't know it was you." "Nobody knew," Samantha said. "That was kind of the point. But I'm tired of hiding. Aren't you—" Before Ethan could answer, Coach Sullivan appeared in the doorway, his face a storm cloud of barely suppressed rage. "Harrison, my office. Now." Ethan tensed, but Samantha put a paint-stained hand on his arm. "You don't have to go," she said quietly. "Not anymore. If you don't, maybe other kids won't end up like David, like my friend Marcus, like Isabella's brother, like all the portraits I've painted." Coach Sullivan stepped into the cafeteria, his presence seeming to suck the oxygen out of the room. "I said now, Harrison, unless you want to explain to your mother why your scholarship just disappeared." "Is that a threat?" Coach Grace Peterson had materialized beside them, her phone still recording, her journalist instincts fully engaged. "Because that sounded like a threat. Care to comment on why you're so concerned about Ethan talking to anyone?" The coach's eyes narrowed. This is none of your business, little girl. Actually, Nathan O'Brien said, appearing on Ethan's other side, I think it's everyone's business, especially when it involves the pills you've been supplying to the team. The silence that followed was deafening. Coach Sullivan's face went from red to white to a kind of mottled purple. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his hand was already reaching for his phone. Maybe not, Isabella Young said, stepping out from behind a pillar where she'd been waiting. But I bet the FBI task force investigating my brother's death would be interested in hearing about it. She held up her phone, showing a contact labeled Agent Martinez. Duh. One call, she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. That's all it takes. So maybe you should be the one heading to your office. Coach, to clean out your desk. The tableau held for a long moment the coach, the students, the weight of secrets about to spill. Then Coach Sullivan turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty cafeteria. He'll be back, Ethan said quietly. He's got too much invested to just walk away. Then we'd better be ready, Samantha said. She looked around at the unlikely group that had formed the artist, the athlete, the journalist, the activist, the witness. All of us. What are you suggesting? Grace asked, though her eyes were already bright with possibilities. I'm suggesting, Samantha said, pulling her hood back up over her coffee-stained hair, that we finish what I started. Every dealer, every enabler, every adult who looked the other way while kids died. I've been painting their victims on walls. But maybe it's time to paint the perpetrators too. That's, Nathan paused, then grinned. That's actually brilliant and terrifying. The best art always is, Samantha said. She turned to Ethan. I'll need details, names, dates, amounts, everything you know. Ethan nodded slowly. You'll have it. But not here, not now. He's got eyes everywhere. Tonight then, Samantha decided. Midnight, the underpass where David— I know the place, Ethan said softly. I go there sometimes, to see your painting. We'll all be there, Grace said, already mentally composing her story. This is bigger than just Riverside High, isn't it? 3 schools, 2 youth leagues, and a pipeline that goes all the way to the state championship committee. Ethan confirmed. David tried to expose it. That's why he started using to get evidence. He thought he could control it. Nobody controls it, Isabella said bitterly. It controls you, until you're just another portrait on a wall. Not anymore, Samantha said firmly. Tonight, we start painting a different picture, one that shows the whole truth. As they prepared to leave, to go to classes they couldn't possibly concentrate on, to pretend for a few more hours that the world hadn't just tilted on its axis, Ethan caught Samantha's arm. The portrait, he said, gesturing to her shirt. How did you make me look so human? Samantha supplied. That's easy. That's what you've always been. You just forgot for a while. She walked away then, leaving Ethan standing in a puddle of spilled coffee, surrounded by the wreckage of his carefully constructed image. But for the first time in months, maybe years, he didn't feel the need to pick up the pieces and rebuild the facade, because sometimes the biggest rebellion isn't throwing the first punch or having the last word. Sometimes it's letting people see who you really are when all the masks come off. And as the videos began to spread, #CoffeeCanvas trending within the hour, people across the city would see more than just a bullying incident gone wrong. They'd see the moment when pain became art, when art became truth, and when truth became the beginning of justice. But that was all still to come. For now, There was just a girl with coffee in her hair and paint on her hands, walking through the halls of Riverside High like she owned them. Because, in a way, she did. She was Ghost. And ghosts, as everyone knows, can walk through walls. The underpass at midnight looked different than it did during Samantha's usual painting sessions. Tonight, the shadows seemed deeper, the distant sound of traffic more ominous. David Harrison's portrait watched from the concrete wall, a boy forever frozen in spray paint and sorrow, smiling the way his brother claimed he never had in life. Ethan arrived first, his Letterman jacket replaced with a plain hoodie that made him look younger, more vulnerable. He stood before his brother's image for a long moment, his fingers tracing the outline of David's face without quite touching the wall. "You made him look happy," he said when he heard Samantha's footsteps. "That's how he looked when he talked about you," she replied, setting down her duffel bag full of spray cans. Right before the end, he smiled and said your name. The others arrived in intervals, Nathan with a laptop and portable hotspot, Grace with professional camera equipment she'd borrowed from the journalism room, Isabella with a backpack that rattled with prescription bottles. "Evidence," she said simply when Ethan looked at her questioningly. "Every pill they pushed. I kept one. My brother was documenting everything. I couldn't look at it until now." They worked through the night, transforming the underpass into something unprecedented. Not just a memorial anymore, but an indictment. Samantha's hands moved with practiced precision, creating a massive mural that told the story in vivid, undeniable detail. Coach Sullivan appeared at the center, his championship ring dripping red. Around him, a web of connections, other coaches, dealers, administrators, even a state senator's aide. Each face was painted with photographic accuracy. Each connection documented with dates and dollar amounts that Ethan provided from memory and Isabella confirmed with her brother's records. "You realize what this means," Nathan said quietly, documenting everything on his laptop. "Once this goes public, there's no taking it back." "Good," Ethan said, his voice hard. "I'm tired of taking things back, of pretending David died from a random overdose, of watching Coach recruit the next generation of victims." Grace live-streamed the creation, her camera catching the interplay of shadow and neon as Samantha worked. The viewer count climbed steadily, hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands as word spread. Comments flooded in, many from other schools, other towns, sharing similar stories. "It's everywhere," Grace breathed. "This isn't just Riverside. People are saying this exact same thing is happening at their schools." "Of course it is," Isabella said bitterly. "You think they'd stop at one school, one team? This is a business. My brother figured out they were making millions." As dawn approached, the mural neared completion, but Samantha had saved the most powerful element for last, in the corner, almost hidden unless you knew to look. She painted a small figure, a boy in a football jersey, number 17 reaching up to touch the hands of all the victims portrayed above. The jersey number was Ethan's. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice rough. "Showing the truth," Samantha said simply, "that you're not the villain here. You're just another victim who got lucky enough to survive, so far." That's when they heard the engines, multiple vehicles, approaching fast. Not the angry roar of Coach Sullivan's truck, but the purposeful sound of authority. Grace swung her camera toward the entrance as black SUVs pulled up, followed by local police cruisers. "Nobody move," Ethan said quietly. "Let me handle this." But it wasn't Ethan they were looking for, Agent Martinez. The DEA agent Isabella had been in contact with, stepped out first, her expression grim but not unkind. "Ms. Young," she said, nodding to Isabella, "thank you for the call. We've been building this case for months, but we needed someone on the inside." She looked at Ethan. "Mr. Harrison, we'll need to speak with you. Your cooperation could save lives." "I know," Ethan said. He looked back at the mural, at his brother's face, at his own jersey number among the victims. "I'm ready." What followed was controlled chaos. Federal agents documenting the mural, taking statements, seizing phones for evidence. But they weren't treating the students as criminals, they were treating them as witnesses, as survivors. Coach Sullivan was arrested at his home at 6:47 a.m., along with 14 others across 3 states. The network, built on the broken bodies of young athletes, came crashing down in a series of pre-dawn raids that made national news. But the real moment of reckoning came 3 hours later, in Riverside High's auditorium. Principal Morrison had called an emergency assembly, intending to do damage control. What he hadn't expected was for Samantha Walker to walk onto the stage, still wearing her coffee-stained shirt with Ethan's portrait, now accompanied by Agent Martinez. "My name is Samantha Walker," she said into the microphone, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent auditorium. "Some of you know me as the quiet girl who draws. Some of you now know me as Ghost. But today, I'm just a teenager who's tired of watching other teenagers die." She looked directly at the section where Ethan usually sat with his team. Half the seats were empty players pulled out by parents, arrested, or in protective custody. "Yesterday, Ethan Harrison poured coffee on my head. Today, we stood together to expose the people who killed his brother. Because that's what they did. They killed David and dozens of others, just as surely as if they'd pulled a trigger." A murmur ran through the crowd. Principal Morrison started to stand, but Agent Martinez's look stopped him cold. "Art isn't just about making pretty pictures," Samantha continued. "Sometimes it's about showing ugly truths. Every tag I've painted, every portrait on every wall, was for someone who can't speak for themselves anymore. But today, we're all speaking. Together." She held up her phone, showing the viral video of the coffee incident. This moment of cruelty became a catalyst for change. Not because I'm special, but because I chose to transform pain into purpose. And if I can do that, so can any of you. Ethan stood up in the audience. His face was haggard, his usual confidence replaced by something rawer but more real. "She's right," he said, his voice cracking. "I've been part of this system. I've taken the pills, pushed them on younger players, looked the other way when kids got hurt. I told myself it was just part of the game, part of being a champion. But champions don't let their brothers die. Champions don't create more victims to feed their own success." Others began standing. Athletes, artists, students who'd lost friends, students who'd remained silent. One by one, they shared their stories. The assembly that was meant to contain the scandal became a testimony to its scope. Grace Peterson's footage of that assembly would win her a full scholarship to Northwestern's journalism program. Nathan O'Brien's data analysis of the network would help convict every major player. Isabella Young would eventually start a foundation in her brother's name. And Samantha Walker. She kept painting, but now she painted in daylight, with permission, on walls donated by businesses and schools that wanted to remember. The underpass where David died became a pilgrimage site, not just for victims of the drug network, but for anyone who'd ever felt powerless against a system bigger than themselves. Ethan Harrison lost his scholarship, lost his position, his popularity, most of his friends. But he found something else in art therapy sessions that Samantha started leading at the community center. He found himself not the golden boy, not the champion, but just Ethan, who missed his brother and was learning to live with that grief without numbing it. 6 months later, as autumn painted the leaves, the same colors Samantha used in her murals, she stood before her latest work. It covered the entire side of the youth center, a massive tree with roots that spelled out names of the lost and branches that reached toward a sunrise. At the base, barely visible unless you knew to look, was a coffee stain transformed into a phoenix. "You know," Ethan said, approaching with 2 cups of coffee from the shop where Jamie Rodriguez now worked. "I never did apologize properly for that." Samantha accepted the cup, inhaling the steam. "Yes, you did. Every time you testified, every time you helped another athlete get clean, every time you chose truth over comfort." They stood together, the artist and the athlete, the ghost and the golden boy, watching as families arrived to see the mural. Parents who'd lost children, siblings who'd lost brothers and sisters, friends who'd lost pieces of themselves. "Do you think David would be proud?" Ethan asked quietly. Samantha looked at the wall, where David's portrait had been incorporated into the roots of the tree, not separate anymore, but part of something larger, something growing. "I think," she said carefully, "he'd be proud that his death meant something, that it saved others, that his little brother finally learned the difference between being strong and being real." As the dedication ceremony began, with city officials and federal agents and grieving families all gathered to acknowledge what had been hidden for so long, Samantha noticed a new piece of graffiti on the adjacent wall. Simple, elegant, unsigned. "Truth is the highest art." She smiled, recognizing Isabella's handwriting. The girl who'd wanted revenge had found something better: justice. And maybe, just maybe, a little peace. The coffee in Samantha's hand was warm, its bitter taste a reminder of how far they'd all come from that moment in the cafeteria. That single act of cruelty had become the catalyst for dismantling an empire built on young bodies and pharmaceutical lies. But more than that, it had shown that even in the darkest moments, transformation was possible. Pain could become purpose. Silence could become song. And sometimes, the biggest revolution started not with violence or volume, but with the quiet scratch of a pencil on paper, the hiss of spray paint on concrete, and the courage to show the world what everyone else was too afraid to see. As the crowd grew, as survivors shared their stories, as the mayor promised reforms, and the FBI confirmed more arrests, Samantha Walker slipped away. There were other walls to paint, other stories to tell, other ghosts to give voice to. But she wasn't alone anymore. Ethan walked beside her, carrying her paint cans. Grace followed with her camera. Nathan brought his laptop. Isabella carried her brother's journal. They'd started as strangers, bound only by proximity and pain. They'd become something else: artists of truth, painters of justice, architects of change. The coffee stain on Samantha's shirt had long since faded, but the mark they'd left on their world, that was permanent. Years later, when documentaries were made and books were written about the Riverside scandal, people always focused on the coffee incident. They'd analyze the video frame by frame, interview experts about youth psychology and institutional corruption. Turn that moment into a symbol of everything wrong with competitive youth sports. But Samantha Walker knew the real story wasn't about the coffee. Standing in her New York gallery 10 years later, surrounded by her legal murals that sold for six figures to collectors who'd never understand their origin, she kept one piece that wasn't for sale. A small canvas, coffee-stained and marker-drawn, preserved behind museum glass. The portrait of a boy crying, not weak, just human. Ethan Harrison flew in for the opening. He was a counselor now, working with young athletes struggling with pressure and addiction. He'd never made it to the NFL, but he'd saved more lives than any Super Bowl champion ever could. "You know what I realized?" he said, standing beside her as patrons mingled with champagne and small talk. "David didn't die because he was weak. He died because the system convinced him that being strong meant suffering in silence." Samantha nodded, watching as a teenager studied her work, a kid with paint-stained fingers and hungry eyes, probably sneaking out at night to tag walls just like she had. "Hey," she called out to the kid, "you paint?" The teenager looked startled, then defiant. "Sometimes," Samantha smiled, remembering another quiet girl who sat in corners and saw everything. "Good, keep painting. But remember, the most powerful art doesn't just decorate walls, it tears them down." The kid's eyes widened with recognition. "You're Ghost!" "Joe," Samantha said, glancing at Ethan, at the portrait that started everything, at the world they'd changed with coffee and courage. "We're all ghosts until we decide to be seen."